Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are signing in to join us today for our Cannabis Corner webinar series number 3, Cannabis in the Body, Understanding the Cannabinoid System. As you can see, there's an opening poll, so if you would just help us out so we can better understand who's coming and participating. And there will also be a closing poll, so we ask you to please just take a few minutes to complete that. As we're waiting for folks to join us, our featured speaker today is Dr. Yasmin Hurd, Ward-Coleman Chair of the Translation, Neuroscience, and Director of the Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai. Today's webinar is eligible for CPH-CE credits from the National Board of Public Health Examiners website. And so as we're entering folks in without further ado, because we want to make sure that we are respectful of people's time and that we're able to get the most out of today's conversation. Just want to take a moment to thank our partners, CannaDiva, the Cultivated Community Foundation, Mixxy Blossom, the East Harlem, Community Board 11, Community Board 12, our beloved Community Board 10, 9, and the New York Cannabusiness Chamber of Commerce. And as always, we'd like to thank the School of Public Health and Health Policy. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Deborah Levine. I am your Community Engagement Officer for the City University, the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. Welcome. Today's webinar, you'll see, we'll be using the Q&A function. As you can see, there is a toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, just move your indicator and it should pop up. You'll see that there's a Q&A and it's circled in green on our screen here. You can click that and put your questions in there. Only the presenter and the host will see the questions until they're answered. Any questions that we get that we're not able to cover today, we will attempt to share with you in our thank you email when we send out the recording. You'll also see at the bottom of the screen that there is a QR code for our polls and our questions if you happen to not see the toolbar at the bottom. Just giving folks a chance to finish our community poll. Today's agenda, again, as I introduce myself, my name is Deborah Levine. I'm the director of the Harlem Health Initiative. Today's presentation is Dr. Yasmin Hurd, who will talk to us about the neuroscience around the cannabinoid system. We'll do a Q&A afterwards and then some quick takeaways. This webinar will be recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, and we'll be happy to share our social media links with you as we move forward. Today's learning objectives include discussing the scientific base of cannabinoids and medical properties. We're also looking at the pathways that the cannabis plant and the cannabinoid system. We're defining the differences between CBD and THC and their role in cannabis medical properties. And then we'll also be summarizing the impact of cannabis on the human psyche and laying the foundation for informative discussions on medical and recreational use. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Dr. Yasmin Hurd. Thank you so much for joining us today. and sharing your knowledge and giving us the opportunity to have a better understanding about your work and about the impact of cannabis on the cannabinoid system.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and the Harlem Health Initiative for inviting me. Let me share my slides. Okay, can you see it?
Sure can.
Okay, let me just move everybody up to the corner here. So again, thank you for inviting me to be part of the discussion. And I hope that as we, the QA section will bring in more information or allow us to have more discussion about a number of things that I necessarily won't bring up in detail here, but lay the foundation for those discussions. So first of all, I think, as you said, we're in this time period of having these debates still about the health impact of cannabis as the recreational and medicinal use have increased in our society. And it's usually these two fractions of our, of the discussion. One being that it's, of course, of no harm, it's healthy, it's an organic plant, it's not addictive, it even reduces anxiety. And many people also believe that it's a wonder drug, that it can treat all these different conditions and disorders. And then on the other side of that coin is the discussions that it does have risk for psychopathology. It can induce addiction, and it can, induce anxiety. And of course, there are many unknown health risks that are of concern to many people. When we think about cannabis, I mean, there are a number of things that I think has made the discussion very complicated. And, I'm not going to go in because today, and I know you'll have other webinars about the history and the legal status and the policies related to the cannabis plant that are very complex. Well, the plant itself is very complex. The biology is complex. The mechanism of action is complex. So I'll just touch on a couple of these points as we go through. First, starting with the complexity of the plant. Many people say, oh, cannabis, or cannabis treats this, cannabis treats that, or cannabis might be negative for this or that. But the cannabis plant contains over 500 chemicals. Over 140 of them are cannabinoids that have different degrees of activities on the body. And, they're, in addition to these cannabinoids, and especially THC, and also cannabidiol, we'll talk about a little bit, there are other chemicals, the terpenes, and so many more that we still don't even understand their biological action, no matter when people say, oh, these do this and do that. There is really very limited science about what they do, and even the ratios and combination of how they interact within the plant themselves and within our bodies in different concentrations. So this complexity is really, a major issue. Also, the issue is, when the cannabis plants original plants on the planet really were, I think, set within, I could say, people would talk about two different types of strains, indica and sativa, that had higher or lower amounts of THC. But today, what's available are these, hybrid strains, because they've mutated these plants to make, change the concentrations of these cannabinoids and even the other chemicals in the plant. So we are talking today not about these original indica sativa plants, but really hybrid strains. And again, not knowing how these hybrid strains, a lot of the chemicals within these plants really impact on the body. We talk about the two main cannabinoids, THC and CBD, and these have different actions. So that's why when people say, oh, cannabis, again, complex plant. What we know about THC is that it's THC that is associated with the reward, the intoxication, not CBD, not cannabidiol. We also know that CBD can decrease anxiety, while THC, even though many people who even initially start consuming cannabis because they say cannabis relaxes them and it's about the THC, low dose THC has been associated with reduced anxiety. but high dose THC actually exacerbates it. It increases anxiety. And when we talk about side effects, we talk about the use of cannabis when, for high, cannabis THC plants that is associated with deficits in the short-term memory, in deficits in judgment, impairing motor coordination, even causing, increased heart rate, sedation, and even withdrawal symptoms. Those are the side effects of THC. CBD has not been shown to have that many side effects in terms of, effects on cognition and motor function. Instead, you see more GI issues, especially at high dose and drowsiness. So even these two main cannabinoids differ very much in their action. But when we talk about cannabis in large part in the recent decades in this debate over, the health impact of cannabis, many people really mean THC, because that is the recreational, people are using cannabis recreationally because of the intoxication effects. And as I said, it's THC that induces that. And the concentration of THC, in which people, we use the word potency, but really meaning concentration of THC, has actually gone up significantly over the years, while that of cannabidiol has gone down. So much so that the ratio of THC to CBD in plants today can be even, 50-fold difference as compared to the original plant. And that is also of, importance to consider as to the health impact when we think about these plants being used today are so different from the original plant. Indeed, we are at historic times of it being highly concentrated, highly potent, and there's a cornucopias, an abundance of products available today than ever before. And these concentrated THC products that can have even, in terms of these products like shatter, the resins, can even give THC concentrations up to like 80, 90%. And the routes by which people can consume cannabis obviously will increase the bioavailability getting into the body. And these are one of the big aspects, is that cannabis, as I said, these products are available for many different flavors, many different, whether it's, sublingual, it's infused into foods. Of course, smoking is still one of the main roots of that, how people take it, but the concentrates are growing in number in terms of how people are consuming this THC, and these concentrates produce, as I said, give high amounts of THC in the body. The other thing of these historic concentrated and potent products is that the varied types of these products. So now cannabis is still illegal federally, is still considered a Schedule I drug, but cannabidiol, which is made from hemp, which has less than 1% THC, people, because as I showed you, CBD does not have this intoxicating effect. So the Farm Bill of 2018 allowed for hemp CBD to not be scheduled anymore. And then you had people and companies now making THC analogs, starting with hemp, starting with CBD, and chemically converting it. And these Delta 9, Delta 10 THC products are themselves intoxicating. And the chemicals that they use to convert them also have health impacts. You also have conversion of the precursor to Delta 9 THC through heat that's being also sold, these Delta 9 products, because they're like, it doesn't come from the cannabis plant. It's then again synthetically derived. And also recently, as we have identified very low concentrations of particular cannabinoids in the plant, they're very rare, but they're extremely potent. In potency means, and when they bind to the cannabinoid receptor, they bind and produce an action much greater than even Delta 9 THC. These rare cannabinoids can now be made synthetically and sold. So all these synthetic products are also one of the issues that we have that we've never had before in our society. So why, many people talk about, yes, initially this is organic plant, but as I showed, these plants are no longer the original plants that were on the planet. They've now been mutated. They've now been changed to make these higher concentrated THC. They've now even made synthetic THC-derived products. But what does it mean for the body and the endogenous system? And our endogenous cannabinoid system, which is called the endocannabinoid system, is also really complex. And it's really complex in a number of ways. So THC binds to cannabinoid receptors throughout the body. There are two main cannabinoid receptor subtypes, CB1 and CB2. The schematic diagram here shows, in the brain, throughout, you can see practically every organ, even in skin, that contains these cannabinoid receptors. These cannabinoid receptors are clearly not there for the consumption of THC, of cannabis. Instead, these cannabinoid receptors are there to mediate the actions of our endogenous cannabinoid ligands. There are two main cannabinoid ligands that are studied a lot now, and the anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol, AEA and 2-AG for short. And these cannabinoids are actually synthesized when they're needed. They're synthesized on demand, and they're synthesized from these lipid fatty acid precursors. But people will say, oh, cannabis and THC is just acting on our endogenous cannabinoid system, and they're not, they've been hiding the system or whatever. But it's really important to understand that we know so little about these endocannabinoid system. In fact, these endogenous ligands were relatively recently discovered in the 1990s. Also, we know that these endocannabinoid system, these ligands, anandamide and 2-AG, we study these two cannabinoids, and everyone thinks that they know, and that we still don't understand these endocannabinoids. But it's important to know that they're part of this extremely complex lipid system. This diagram doesn't even begin to show the complexity of the interaction with other lipids and other biological systems from which they are derived, these endocannabinoids, and when they are metabolized, how they, the impact on other biological systems. It's an incredibly complex system. So there's no way that we understand the full effect of THC and even cannabidiol on our endogenous cannabinoid system that is so complex, and scientists still are trying to understand it, much less to teach it to physicians who are, and teach it in medical school, so that physicians can inform their patients. When we think about the endocannabinoid system, like I said, these two cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, there are many more than that. I didn't emphasize in the last diagram. There are all these cannabinoid receptors. These are cannabinoid and non-cannabinoid receptors that mediate the actions of our endogenous cannabinoid ligands. There are many of them, in fact, more than I have here. And these endocannabinoids are synthesized and degraded by a number of enzymes that we still don't understand, but they're key regulators. And they're key regulators of a number of biological functions. And I guess that's not surprising when you see that these cannabinoid receptors are expressed throughout the body. They're critical for energy metabolism, appetite, regulating, temperature in the body, immune function and inflammation, the development of not just the brain here, but a number, obviously, of organs. They impact on, my bias obviously comes from neuroscience in the brain in terms of impacting on learning and memory, pain, and psychomotor function, our circadian or sleep-wake cycle, regulating stress and emotions, and even in reproduction. So think about it, this is a very broad modulatory system on multiple biological processes. So when we say that we may consume cannabis to help our appetite, it's also impacting on all of these other things, because there's not a specific, when you consume cannabis, it's not specifically going to just those quote unquote processes that regulate appetite. As I said, I'm a neuroscientist, so a lot of the work that we do relates to the brain. And we can see that these are the cannabinoid receptor, the cells in the brain that express the cannabinoid receptors, and you can see that they're broadly distributed throughout the brain. In fact, the cannabinoid receptor, and in the brain, it's mainly the CB1 receptor that is most prominent. CB2 is also there, but in a much lower levels. But these CB1 receptors, they are in fact the most abundant receptors that are on the surfaces of cells in our brain, the most abundant. And they play a really critical role in regulating how cells communicate. They modulate the synapse in terms of that's the area between the two cells communicating. And so this is a really critical, it plays such a critical role in the brain in modulating neural cell activity. So for me and for many others, the endocannabinoid system and its role in the brain actually starts much earlier for understanding its impact, or the beautiful nature. The endocannabinoid system is beautiful. It plays, like I said, these very important but broad biological processes. And for me, one of them is neurodevelopment. And the reason is that we can see that this is a schematic overview of like the dynamic changes throughout development from early gestation, infancy, and throughout to adulthood, of changes, for example, the cannabinoid receptors, the actual endocannabinoid ligands, and the enzymes that synthesize them. So we know that from a number of studies that the endocannabinoid system is actually critical for hardwiring of the brain. How the neural pathways are set, the synaptic connectivity, these are really highly regulated by the endogenous cannabinoid system. This is the cannabinoid receptor expression that I showed you in the adult brain before. This is now looking in the human fetal brain. And we can see that it's expressed even in mid-gestational, as I said, the endocannabinoid system plays a critical role in neurodevelopment. So it's there early in the brain. But you can see here mid-gestational expression in brain regions such as the amygdala, here the mouse, a brain region critical for emotional regulation, stress regulation, hippocampus, again, that will go on to be really critical for memory, areas of these regions called the nucleus accumbens, important for goal-directed behavior, reward, and so on. So that's why when we think about brain health in regard to cannabis, the developing brain is a really important question for us, because indeed we know that now, even though most psychiatric disorders are diagnosed in adulthood, we know that they have a developmental origin. And so we know that, yes, many teens will start consuming cannabis, the age where they start experimenting, but the developmental origin for brain health, and actually not just brain health, all health, actually starts in utero. So when we look at the endocannabinoid system, as I said earlier, it's really, it's present from very early. It is essential for how cells, the birth of cells, how they migrate through the brain, the synapses they form. So this is really important, that since the critical role of the endocannabinoid system in neurodevelopment, when we now know that, pregnant women are increasing their use of cannabis, we even have like nearly 60% of women of childbearing age will use cannabis even daily during a time period when the endocannabinoid system plays such a role. Obviously, the women use cannabis while breastfeeding. There's more cannabis smoking indoors as well when In certain states, when cannabis was legalized, is the increase in the secondhand smoke that children consume, but also for the teenagers. Again, more and more teenagers are consuming during a time period when there is the brain is still maturing. So I'm going to show a couple of results regarding cannabis exposure at different developmental windows. I'm going to focus on in utero, and later on we'll go to adolescence, just to show that we can see significant changes in relation to cannabis exposure. So for example, in utero use exposure to cannabis, we can see changes, the expression of proteins and genes that are really important to the cytoskeletal, the structure of the brain, you could say, this, and to synaptic plasticity. We can see that there are significant changes in regard to our endogenous opioid system. These endogenous opioid system are important for reward, emotional regulation, even response to stress and pain. And this correlates to the amount of cannabis the mothers reported using. We also see that in utero exposure to cannabis can change our endogenous dopamine system, and dopamine mediates rewards, again, goal-directed behavior. But importantly, these changes, this reduction, for example, in the receptor that mediates the action of dopamine, often in adults with substance use disorders and a number of other related psychiatric disorders, there's this alteration in the dopamine D2 that many people, it's the chicken and the egg, was that these individuals have these impairments of dopaminergic system before they use drugs. But here during prenatal life, we see that there's already this regulation of dopamine associated with cannabis exposure. We can see that in this amygdala, this region important for emotional regulation, that it's really driven by the boys that were exposed prenatally in utero to cannabis. But importantly, because human studies are complicated, we can replicate this in our animal models where we control the amount of, for example, THC they get, and we know their life history. A big question is, though, does it really have any impact in utero exposure to cannabis? And so we can look at kids across time and into adulthood. Those studies are very tough. These longitudinal studies, study that I'm doing with my colleague Yoko Nomura at CUNY. And we can see that, how can we look at the in utero environment to get an understanding of its impact on later outcomes for the offspring? So we look at the placenta. And the placenta is really important because we know that it's essential, obviously, the most essential temporary organ that exists, the placenta, that's critical for neurodevelopment. But we also know that programming within the placenta is linked to psychiatric risk later in life, for example. And when we look at the genes that are expressed in the placenta in women that used cannabis, we could even see, the cannabinoid receptor expression is reduced and correlated to the amount of cannabis the moms reported using. But when we look in an unbiased manner at the expression of all these thousands of genes, one thing became apparent. There's increases and decreases in the genes that are expressed, but a lot of them relates to the immune system. No matter how we look at it, immune dysregulation was evident. Once again, we could replicate in our rodent models, and in the human and our rodent models, it showed that the males were more affected. The male placenta, I should say, was more affected. And the endocannabinoid system and cannabis itself plays a really strong role in regulating immune function. So again, perhaps not surprising, but still surprising in the strong effect that we saw in the placenta. But like I said, does it really have an impact on the future outcome of their children? So in looking at the kids, we could see a number of things. For example, when studied during infancy, their stress hormone levels are much higher than individuals that were not exposed to cannabis. When they come in each year to look at clinical behavioral assessments, we could see, for example, anxiety, hyperactivity was significantly higher. But it's important to also realize that, we don't exist in a world where everything is necessarily perfect. And in conditions where there were excessive stress to the mothers while pregnant, and they had also exposure to use cannabis, there is a combination, there's a synergistic interaction between cannabis and stress. So that, for example, the combination of both exposure increased the anxiety outcome of their kids to a much greater extent. And so it's important that we don't just think about cannabis in its own. Importantly, what we also saw was that the gene expression patterns in the placenta actually predicted the anxiety behavior that we saw in children with prenatal cannabis exposure. So in utero exposure to cannabis during a time period where the endocannabinoid system plays this critical role in neurodevelopment, we do see impact on children later in life. Again, we could replicate in animal models and show these changes, actually, this dysregulation of the immune system, and we can then follow our animal models into later life, just like our human studies. Now we can go to adulthood in the animals, but we can see that there are changes related to affective behavior in terms of emotional related behavior, social interaction, depression-like behavior, stress sensitivity when they become adults, and even opioid sensitivity when they become adults. So in utero exposure, clearly, like I said, during this time window is important for later, for effects on the offspring. So the next developmental window that we've studied, and many people now as well, obviously, is adolescence, a time period where naturally people experiment. And we also know that the prefrontal cortex is that last region of the brain to achieve full maturity. And this is a time window also where the endocannabinoid system plays a really important role in fine-tuning these neural circuits towards their final maturation. And unfortunately, it's also a time window where there's increased cannabis consumption, especially now also growing even vaping of these THC products that I showed earlier. So why is this important? It's important because we do know that adolescent cannabis use is actually a very critical window for future cannabis use disorder risk. In fact, among young youth and young adults who use cannabis, about 22% of them will meet a cannabis use disorder. And cannabis use disorder was most prevalent in among the young adults compared to the cohort of like 21-year-old emerging adults. So the earlier you're using, you then develop, you have an earlier chance of developing cannabis use disorder. But when we look at cannabis use disorder across, irrespective of age, we do know that about approximately 10 to 30%, depending on the subpopulation, will develop a cannabis use disorder. So that also means that not everyone develops a cannabis use disorder who consumes cannabis. And however, even the 70% who don't, of those, at least half of them do develop other challenges relevant to health risk. Again, I'm focusing on psychiatric risk. Neuroscience is, my field, and we can see that in the brains of individuals who develop the cannabis use disorder, there are structural biological changes, there are functional changes in these brain regions that are studied with neuroimaging techniques that actually resemble changes that are seen with other substance use disorders, even like cocaine and heroin. So we do know that cannabis is not just benign on the brain. But it's not just cannabis use disorder that, the use of cannabis during adolescent time window is important, because other psychiatric disorders are at risk during this time, from schizophrenia and related psychosis, anxiety, depression. In fact, there is a high psychiatric comorbidity with cannabis use disorder. So whether it's, schizotypical disorders, anxiety-related disorders, there's a very high comorbidity. So what does the endogenous cannabinoid system looks like? People have done neuroimaging looking at cannabinoid receptors in those who have cannabis use disorder. And they could see that as compared to healthy individuals, those individuals that had a cannabis dependence cannabis use disorder, their cannabinoid receptors are much lower because their cannabinoid receptors are being bombarded with the THC. So these cannabinoid receptors become internalized. But the association between cannabis use disorder during this early developmental window into young adulthood is also seen being important for schizophrenia. So, for example, in Denmark, a country that has socialized medicine, so they have information on maybe practically everyone, they could see that there was an increase in schizophrenia that paralleled in part the increase of cannabis, especially high potency concentrated cannabis in THC products in their country over the last 2 decades. Psychiatric disorders don't just pop out that or change in that increase in such a short time window. But one of the things that they could see was that the proportion of these schizophrenia cases actually associated with cannabis use disorder, and primarily in those between, for example, between 16 to 20-year-olds, and again, much higher in males than females. After age 26, there was not a difference at all. So they could predict that the preventable cases of schizophrenia, about 30% of that was related to cannabis use disorder. So reducing cannabis use disorder would say that they could reduce schizophrenia by 30%. This prefrontal cortical area is really important for a number of the psychiatric risk. And as I said, this is the last region of the brain to gain full maturity. There have been debates for years, and there will continue to be debates whether or not adolescent cannabis use changes the structure of the cortex. Studies have shown that it does. A more recent study in Europe showing that, again, that there's thinning of the cortex that correlated with cannabis use in the teens, and as well with their impulsive behavior, and that these changes even were associated with the areas of the cortex that were very rich in the cannabinoid receptor. Because of these, high debates that occur in our society as to whether or not cannabis use is causing these structural changes, for example, in the cortex, we can use our animal models to look at, does adolescent THC exposure have any impact on the prefrontal cortex? And we can actually look at the structure of these cortical cells. And we can see that in young adults that had these adolescent THC exposure, not everything has changed in their cortex structurally, not at all. But what was changed is the complexity. There's reduced complexity in these animals that had adolescent THC exposure. And interestingly, the structural changes resembled animal models that have undergone significant stress. One of the things in the animal models that we can do is that we could actually pick up these cells and we could sequence them to see what may be the underlying molecular signatures. And we could see that the underlying molecular signatures were very distinct in those young adults that have had adolescent THC exposure compared to the normal developing adolescent brain. In fact, there was a really strong reprogramming so that they shared only about 5%. So there was a 95% reorganization within these cortical cells. And what was changed, not surprising, genes related to the structure of these cells, to the synaptic plasticity, these little where cells communicate, but also changes related to epigenetic mechanisms. And epigenetic mechanisms, basically, for genetics, you inherit your DNA sequence from your parents. That doesn't change. But the environment can put tags onto your DNA or these modifications that change how genes are turned on and off and how those cells therefore function. And these epigenetic changes were significantly altered. They were significantly altered to such an extent so the relationship normally between these synaptic plasticity genes and those that relate to epigenetic mechanisms were completely reorganized in adults with adolescent THC exposure. And they reflected biological networks that we see in individuals who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So a lot of research has really gone on about the risk of cannabis use disorder during adolescence And there are sex differences. Males show uh, greater likely to be diagnosed with cannabis use disorder, and they show a higher frequency of use. But actually, females can progress faster with the cannabis use disorder. But the highest risk that is seen is individuals who start cannabis prior to age 16 and those who sustain use into adulthood. So this is one of the, and of course, obviously those who are using more frequently, especially those with daily use. So, and one of the things that is also seen that the early predictors of use relates to prenatal exposure, again, intense stress during childhood, and even early tobacco and alcohol use is important to also put into that context. So when we think about the endocannabinoid system, it's and the aspects of where we are today in our society with cannabis, we see more cannabis use disorders and challenges with cannabis use in teens and young adults. And perhaps it may be related to the high potency THC products out there. Because as I mentioned, our endogenous cannabinoid system is really critical for maintaining normal synaptic regulation. It's really a powerful modulator. It helps us. But if it's bombarded with very potent or high concentrated THC, it now turns into a pathological synaptic regulation. And we know that these high concentrated, high potency cannabis products have a much greater risk of inducing psychosis, depression, anxiety, and cannabis use disorders. And teens, just like adults, they're not titrating their use of these high potency or high concentrated cannabis products because they don't even know that there was a lower version to even have, to even consume, because what's available today are these high concentrated products. Again, we can use animal models to look at the impact of does dose matter? And we can see that adults with adolescent THC exposure to high dose THC during adolescence still show these high levels of the stress hormones as adults. They also are much more sensitive to even acute stress in self-administering for rewarding products. Well, here is a for reward, but only in those that have had high dose, not low dose THC exposure during adolescence. And I'm not going to go into all the brain changes, but we can see that there are alterations in the brain that actually, for here in the amygdala of brain region, not only critical for regulating anxiety and stress, but also even decision making. And we can see that it's a high potency, high concentrated THC that alters these amygdala and even prefrontal cortical function that relates directly to their impulsivity and decision making, but mainly when they're stressed. So that there is this combination of high dose adolescent THC exposure. And then when they're stressed in adulthood, we can also look and see that there are certain cells now that become really strongly involved in or are changed in these adults. Some of those cells are, for example, called astrocytes that actually play an important role in regulating how these synapses communicate and even in aspects of immune function. The structure of these are changed. And importantly, they also relate to the change of the structure of these astrocyte cells relate to decision-making and impulsivity in these animals when they're adults, but only, again, when they're stressed. So there's an important, we know that the endocannabinoid system and of course, therefore, cannabis is really important regulating immune and stress. When people think about the endocannabinoid system in regard to stress, at least, it's a powerful system of helping to regulate our stress response. In fact, it's normal. So normally, our stress hormone can regulate our endocannabinoids ligands, and they become the brake to reduce our stress response. However, when they're chronically changed, then that brake is off. And that's one of the things why high use of high concentrated, high potency THC products, their impact on the endocannabinoid system with repeated use, they're changing our stress response. So we're no longer, those brakes are then being released. So we can say that, the potency matters, the cannabinoid matters, and the developing brain matters. I'm going to just end on two things. One, it talks about early life effects of cannabis, prenatal, adolescence, but also what happens at later aging. And we know that, the endocannabinoid system, as I said earlier, is important for cognition, pain, appetite, sleep, a lot of things, agitation, is one of the things also that aged individuals are interested in. There are a lot of debates whether or not cannabis can be beneficial to the aging brain, for example. We know that in the younger time period, especially with now that there's more high dosage use, there are harmful effects related to psychosis, anxiety. But some studies are beginning to show that, yes, you can get, but again, low dosage THC may actually reduce those, I should say, reduce like inflammatory processes that are linked to, cognitive impairments and so on, and causing the growth of cells that may be important for cognition. And there are studies that have seen like that the acute effects of THC differs between those who are young and old. So for example, giving people different products, CBD versus THC in red versus a combination of THC and CBD, that, you can see differences in those that are young and those that are old. When you look at what happens to, for example, their cognition, this is a memories test. Interestingly, older individuals shows improve cognition compared to younger. But the younger individuals show much greater craving when there's THC products. So there's more deleterious effects seen in younger individuals as compared to older, but there's also an impact of craving that you see more in the young people. But there are also side effects seen in older individuals, dizziness, which is a problem in terms of people, older individuals falling, anxiety, worsening of memory, and again, in the aspect of dose matters. So when, in older individuals, that the dose made a big difference, not surprisingly, just as younger individuals as well. But a quick end to all of this is, I started about the developing the impact of the endocannabinoid system relevant to neurodevelopment. But it's important to understand that the endocannabinoid system that I showed earlier is in practically every organ and in our reproductive organs as well, that regulate, formation of eggs and the implantation of eggs in placenta and so on. And also it impacts on the sperm cell. So the question for us at one point was, is there a cross-generational transmission? So are there germline effects? And so we can use our animal models where they can fall in love. They have, like, for example, exposure to THC earlier in life, later to fall in love. They've never used THC again, and can look at their offspring. And it was interesting, we could see that opioid sensitivity that we saw in adults with adolescent THC exposure, their kids who had never directly, you could say, been exposed to THC, they also showed this sensitivity and changes in their synaptic plasticity that's measured on a number of levels. But interestingly, even into their great grandkids, they could see that they still showed changes in reward sensitivity. So I say all that is that it's a complex plant, the complex biology, mechanism of actions that we still don't understand, that it might even extend beyond the current generation to other generations. So with that, I hope that that gives us a foundation for our discussion, and I'll stop here.
Dr. Hurd, I feel like you've just opened up a whole new arena for me to now begin to think about things in a different sort of way. We have a ton of questions that have come in, so
Okay.
thank you so much for all of the science. I just want to say really quickly again, the Q&A is starting now, and for those who have just joined us, you can find the QR code on the left-hand side where it says polls and questions to post your question, or you can use your mouse to bring up the toolbar at the bottom where it says Q&A, and you can put your question in there. We do have several.
Okay.
So I want to get started. Once again, thank you so much for all of this information. We actually have a question that says, how does cannabis affect older adults' memory? You mentioned that there was possibly some physical implications, but they want to know, does cannabis expedite the risk of dementia? And has that been studied?
It's a really important question. And I will say with every question perhaps that people are going to ask, the answer is going to be probably the same. It's being studied. And it's being studied because, as I mentioned before, even the endocannabinoid system was just recently those primary endocannabinoid ligands were more recently discovered. So we're still learning a lot. And as the change in the legal landscape for cannabis, and more cannabis products being available, more research is being done. And for the cognition and dementia, the results are mixed. And as I said, but those studies are just in infancy. So there are studies that show that low dose THC may improve cognition in elderly. There are even, again, I'm going to come back to differences in the cannabinoid. THC can cause an exacerbation, worsen memory, and worsen cognition, especially at high doses. But cannabidiol, there's some studies have started to show, can even reduce some of the pathological features that we see, for example, related to dementia. But it's cannabidiol, CBD, not THC. There also, THC has been shown to change some of the inflammatory patterns you see associated with some dementia. So the data is not clear, and the studies are in process, and many of them are animal models, and we don't know how much they relate to the human condition. So unfortunately, I'm going to say the same. It's like to say, stay tuned for those results. But for me, again, another answer I will give is that dose matters. So for everything, when people are thinking about cannabis in regard to the medicinal side of it, it is to keep the dose as low as possible.
Thank you. So we have another question here. How does our understanding of the cannabinoid system inform discussions about cannabis regulations and legislation? So we're really moving into that public policy lane.
Yeah. The sad thing is that policies were never developed in considering the endocannabinoid system at all. I mean, in one way, I don't know if perhaps if they consider science for many of the policies that are made for many other things, right? But absolutely, the endocannabinoid system, as I showed, plays such a critical role. It's in practically every cell in our bodies, and it's a modulatory system on many biological processes. So policies were made not thinking also about the developmental role that our endogenous cannabinoid system plays. So, what does it mean for the developing brain when you're impacting a biological system that has such a huge role? So I think that was a missed opportunity to understand the science, and to actually, and even there was actually enough science to inform policymakers. With that said, I'm not a policymaker. I don't know how, the aspects of balancing all of the science. There's never any, I don't think that there's any system in our body that's not quote unquote important, or it wouldn't be there. So, everything that we eat, everything that we inhale has a possibility of impacting in something in our bodies. So I'm biased, obviously. I do think that policies should have considered some aspects of our endogenous cannabinoid system, but they didn't. In the brain, it plays, as I showed, huge impact on regulating the regulating, how cells communicate, and that is also critical because of not thinking about perhaps the concentrated products that are available the policies that are made. Should policies have considered concentration and dose and the abundance of products when, that's something that should be discussed.
Thank you. So we have another question, and I'm glad you raised the research question, but here is one. What research gaps exist in our understanding of how cannabis interacts with the cannabinoid system, and what areas should future studies focus on? So I guess that's also from a medical, and if you could also respond to that from a public health perspective, and because I know the intersection of your work is not just on the medical side, but also looking at from a public health perspective.
Yeah, I mean, medicine is about public health, right? You are supposed to treat your patients in the best caution as possible. So yeah, so when we think about cannabis as quote unquote medicine, that's something that has to be done. So for me, there's so much research that's needed. So for example, as I said, the endocannabinoid system is part of a very complex biological process that we still do not understand. So on a fundamental level, I think that that research is needed. When you think about medicine, we do need to understand and have more research done for specific disorders. So for example, one of your questions, the first one you mentioned, Deborah, dementia. Countries like Israel actually was much further ahead in conducting research on the potential medicinal properties of cannabis. So there's a lot of data that's being gained there. We need to do more of those studies here. We also need to, and I mean, some of the research is challenging because remember, there's also certain ethical things where the doses use high dose and may cause negative effects on people. So the experiments have to be designed really properly to reduce the risk of any negative adverse events. But we don't know. We now see, for example, myocardial infarctions, which people had not really realized with cannabis users. That now is showing up more. Why? Because now research with these big databases, for example, the UK Biobank, they have a lot of data. I mean, people, some few research has shown some heart-related things. Now, these thousands of data that's available with, the use of cannabis, they're able now to show an association. But is it causal? You'll need to have animal models go in part with these clinical studies. And I think that that's what's really essential. I think because of the high debate that goes on about cannabis, because there's a lot of misinformation, in fact, disinformation about cannabis and about our endogenous cannabinoid system, we need to show aspects also of causality that can help. So to me, we need more partnering between clinical research and preclinical models to help, interpret, even if animal models, of course, are not human studies. And of course, human studies are much more complicated. So I would definitely think that that's very important. But I do think, again, my bias is about risk of disorders. And risk comes into early life. So we do need to spend more research looking at the impact on kids, teens, and young adults, because we know we can reduce psychiatric risk by, helping kids earlier in life. We know that stress, adverse events, and issues of some certain substance use, not just cannabis, early in life. What do we do as a society to improve their health outcomes as adults and be all that they should be, but yet still the health risks the psychiatric risk, we wait until people develop these and then we abandon them. So for me, as a public health issue, I would love to see more research done on prevention and early intervention rather than waiting on, till more and more people until how many people have to, how many people, I guess, died before, seatbelts were put in terms of a policy of health of, policymakers. Do we wait until we see a certain number of issues happening in our society related to cannabis before we go in? I think we need to learn from other policies that were made for the, health, for the public health. And public health, I think, is really critical.
I agree. So we do have another question here that sort of wants to expand on the challenges that exist in conducting research on cannabis, particularly in terms of the regulatory barriers and access to funding.
Yeah, I wish that, when I started studying cannabis, it was very difficult to get research funding, not going to lie. And from my fellow colleagues, even, because they didn't believe that, well, two things that I studied that. They didn't believe that studying that cannabis was, quote unquote, relevant to study as compared to cocaine. Because, even they thought, oh, cannabis is not an addictive drug. And we know that it is. And now, especially as the THC concentrations has increased, that becomes a greater risk. So getting grants was tough. When I started doing clinical studies with cannabidiol, so one of the things, just because of time, even though my research showed cannabis can increase sensitivity for opioid use in adulthood, in our animal models, we'd mainly studied THC. So I then wanted to look at another cannabinoid. And I'm like, just to make sure, because in humans it's cannabis, but our animal models was THC. So I said, let's study cannabidiol. And at that time, no one knew what CBD really was. And again, it was very difficult to get funding to look at those studies. And when we did get, a small amount of funding to do our first human studies in people with heroin use disorder, CBD, it was difficult because of the scheduling at that time of CBD. It was considered a Schedule I drug. So I remember my clinical research coordinator had to be chaperoned by a security guard from the pharmacy to our labs to give the CBD to our study participants. So it was very difficult. But those studies showed us that CBD actually reduced heroin craving, reduced cue-induced anxiety, and our animal models had shown us that. So now we are running a big study with CBD in people with opioid use disorder, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, and that's another thing for research. We need more placebo-controlled, blinded studies in order to interpret the results. So for me, it has been a challenge. Now that CBD is no longer scheduled, it becomes easier to do those kind of research. But THC is still federally Schedule I, which means that it is very challenging to do research with cannabis products. But the National Institutes of Health, they do have programs to help researchers who want to do cannabis research more easily to do them today. But it wasn't like that earlier. So I think a number of the barriers to research has decreased in studying cannabis, but it was very challenging, very challenging until like about 2 years ago.
So thank you for that, Dr. Hurd. I have a couple of questions that are popping in. One of them is, I know you're a neuroscientist by training, but what are some of your opinions on the current policy landscape regarding recreational cannabis in New York City? Do you have any recommendations for what could be done? How do we make sure that the big THC companies don't abuse or aggressively market to populations who are predisposed to vulnerabilities, i.e. youth, marginalized populations, etc.?
That is a very, very, very tough question. And I I try not to, quote unquote, put too much of my biased neuroscience hat on and a neurodevelopmental, a researcher that studies the neurodevelopmental effects of cannabis. Clearly, I do think a lot of guardrails needs to be developed. And I do think that policymakers should listen to, bring in many different stakeholders. I think often people think that money is important. And so the big companies may have more money to, impact things a certain way. We have to, as a society, balance money over health. And the policymakers, I think, need to go into the communities, especially those communities that will be most impacted by this. I do think that they need to have more people at the table to help inform the policies that are created. And one thing that I think that's important is that you can't create a policy for this neighborhood, but not for that town or that other part of the state. Clearly, it has to be, to me, a comprehensive policies that are made that protects people, even if they may not be in your community. If you open up, all the stores in one area or dispensaries in one area, and there are a lot of different things that come with that. So I'm not saying that this is an easy thing to do because the genie is already out of the bottle. I think policies were made without thinking about all of these things. And now that it's there, it's going to be very difficult to say, how do you, reel back in, thinking of concentration, thinking of potency, thinking of the products that are there, because now a lot of these big companies and small companies, they want to make money, but they want to make money that can be at the risk of public health. So it is about balancing, learning from the issues that were there from the tobacco industry. I don't think we should start at the beginning where the tobacco industry is and say, trust all the companies to do the right thing. We know that doesn't happen. We know that, even vaping of, tobacco products, what companies did in targeting youth, even if they say there wasn't targeting, we know that it does. So we need to learn from the experiences of the past in guiding the policies that are made for cannabis, rather than waiting for the same things to happen over and over again before, we learn.
Thank you. So Jeff just posed a question. Can change be detected by a long-term user if never tested before for cannabis use and tested now? Change in the body, brain, and the CB1 or CB2?
That's an excellent question. And this is the thing, going back to the question about research. When we talk about, when I show some of those changes on biological, whether the cannabinoid receptor is changed or so on, it's versus a group. So we have group effects. We do not yet have true biomarkers that can give an index of where this person might be in their disorder, whatever disorder or not, maybe, for a number of the, obviously our blood pressure, we know when we're in the range for something being bad versus that we're in a normal range. And many people can use cannabis and don't develop any negative adverse events, especially if they're not using these very, highly concentrated products. And they have cannabis products that have CBD in them and they're not using daily. There are people who consume alcohol socially without having an alcohol misuse or disorder. So the same can happen with cannabis. What we don't have are the biomarkers to know that this is this means that you have this disease risk, or you have developed this, or you have been using cannabis, for this amount of time. One thing with chronic users, if they haven't used in a while, you can still detect cannabinoid metabolites in their body, weeks later. If you were just using like acutely about a week, you're not going to be testing positive. So even that is challenging if someone says they haven't used acutely, but but they are chronic consumers. They may test positive for, in a urine tox, but they may not have used acutely. So even those markers are not, good enough right now. And those are, I think, a really important research is needed to develop those kind of biomarkers.
Thank you. Just want to give you a comment from James. Just as veterans and the VA were instrumental in bringing PTSD to public and health policies, as a veteran, I believe the VA and the veteran community is a powerful conduit for research, medical, and public policy. It's also gaining traction in Congress. So I just wanted
Agreed.
to share and
Yeah.
acknowledge that there are two sides to this conversation.
Yeah, but the PTSD, I just want to add, I mean, I
Please.
completely agree, but I don't, this is the thing, and I would love for our society, and we frame it, as I said, the benefits and the risk. There are not two sides to this. There's a continuum. It's not two sides, it's a continuum. So PTSD, for example, many people will use cannabis. And I do think that PTSD needs special attention because it's it comes in and associated with a number of other disorders. So we need to really be able to help and individuals. But dose matters there, because some studies with cannabis shows that it actually did not work with PTSD individuals and could even exacerbate their disorder. So we do need the VA to absolutely be a part of this, to do the research. And the one thing that is great about the VA, you really have good medical information about everyone. So perhaps we can then see which subgroups of individuals may benefit from cannabis-related medicines versus others that might benefit from another type of medicine. No medicine on this planet will treat every disorder and not have side effects. What we're trying to do is to identify the subgroups that may benefit from this with lower side effects versus another thing. So we should stop trying to be the either or, but to realize we're talking about a continuum.
Thank you so much. I see that we are quickly running out of time, so I want to thank everyone here, but I also want to give you an opportunity to give us some closing thoughts, some takeaways before we close, because this conversation has been extremely thought-provoking and definitely instructional.
I really appreciate what the Harlem Initiative is trying to do. It's about education, but more so what you're trying to do. It's about discussion. I think that we all have to be at the table. Every, the veteran, the policymaker, the scientist, the physician, the people who are with the lived experiences, the teachers, there's so many people that need to be there. And as I said, this has been framed as the us versus them, and it's not. This is such a critical biological process, our endocannabinoid system. It plays such an important role a positive role in mediating and keeping us healthy. That's the thing. It keeps us healthy. And perhaps parts of it can be leveraged for medicine. But if we go over a certain extent, that critical biological process can then work against us and make us unhealthy. So it is about us working together and coming up with reasonable policies founded on, to me, research, founded on the science that can give people hope that they're not going to be that they will be healthy, that our society is really looking out for them. Public health is public health. So to me, everybody should be involved in this discussion. So thank you.
Want to thank you for giving of your time, for you taking the time to do this work and to better educate our community as a whole. Just again, to reiterate, the School of Public Health and Health Policy is not here to tell people what to do, but to really create a safe space to have these conversations, to be able to share the science, to address the misinformation and disinformation. So hopefully that we can develop strategies for being able to educate our larger community. And we so agree, everyone has to be at the table for this conversation. So thank you again all for attending our Cannabis Corner webinar series. Dr. Hurd, you have a family here. Please, as you are continuing your work and your research, please feel free to come back and keep us updated, keep us grounded, so that we're making sure that the information that we're sharing with our elected officials, with other medical providers, with our community at large, have the best science-based information to make most informed decisions. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our partners again. All of you have been wonderful in supporting this work. I will close in saying that if you want more information about medical cannabis, please reach out to your physicians and get that information. Even if it is you're considering recreational, please do it safe. Please make sure that if you are consuming, that you are going to licensed outlets and not illicit outlets. Again, it is not our goal here to tell people what to do, but to make sure that you have the most informed, science-based information. And thank you to our partners. Really quickly, we have an upcoming event. On June 25th, we have Dr. Douglas Charles and Dr. Maurice Henson coming to talk about the therapeutic applications of cannabis. So we'd love to see you all joining us. Also, the Harlem Health Initiative and the City University Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy will be joining the Black Health Connect Conference in Washington, D.C., which is also hybrid, to again talk more about the health and wellness of cannabis and the connection to our community, looking at it from a medical aspect, but also from a legislative perspective. And you'll see that the registration link is in our chat section for both of these webinars. You will also find all of our upcoming webinar series information, both on our Facebook page. We have Instagram, we have a community newsletter, and LinkedIn. So please follow us. There will be more series coming out. All of these are on our YouTube channel. And you can also apply for continuing education credits as we move forward. Dr. Hurd, we thank you again for the graciousness of your time, your energy, and your talents.
No, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you all. Please take a few moments to complete the survey so that we can make sure that we know who is with us and how we can better serve you. Thank you all and have a great day.